Welcome. Thank you for coming. Bill and I were talking this morning, we've got this new book coming out called Scaling Leadership, and so part of what we want to just reflect back to you is that collectively, together, we're scaling conscious leadership in the world. And from what we can tell, we're actually moving the needle on that together. It's not us, it's us. And so thank you for that. It's a privilege to be here with you. Thanks for showing up.
Bob and I walked into yesterday morning, which we had an experience of going to Martin Luther King's burial and birthplace in Atlanta. And we then transitioned from there to Jimmy Carter Center, to the Carter Center. And we both thought we knew something about leadership. And we had an experience of humility, of learning next level out what we don't know and what's required there for two individuals and all those around them that, in one case, literally laid down his life for what he believed in another case, has given his entire life for what he believed in, as well as that of Roosevelt and all those around President Carter. And then we get to show up here with you. And when we talk about scaling conscious leadership into the planet and what it means, we do mean we. And we couldn't do it without the work that exists in this room and across the planet with those that have accepted their own calling. And I was struck this morning as our check-in that my friend Sammy, our friend Sammy over here from Nairobi, showed up on, social media, I think 4 years ago, Sammy? Yeah. And just decided to connect in. And Sammy's persistent in a wonderful way, What a gifted human being. And this year, Aronde went down to Nairobi in East Africa, and Sammy did a certification. And all of a sudden, I'm finding myself on a Zoom call with this wonderful group of people whom I've never met before, but I have met before, and saw what Sammy manifested into the world come to its next level of fruition. And that's what we find, is that we get called and we show up. And showing up is a significant portion of what's required and what makes a difference. So thank you for showing up.
How many were here last year? Wow. How many were not?
The rest.
Oh, more. Wow. Okay. How many are sort of brand new to the leadership circle? Okay, great. So what we want to do, here's the plan. We're going to start with kind of laying some foundation and build up to where we left off last year. Do that in, say, the first half hour, 40 minutes. Then we got to respect your bladders and take a break. And then we'll come back and we want to talk about scaling leadership. How do leaders scale leadership in the organization and thereby transform them? And that's one chapter out of our new book on scaling leadership. Okay, that's the plan. Got it? So we started last year with this notion, and it's really when I started my work in this field, I've cared about one thing: how do you bring out the true wellspring of being that exists in all of us and put it in service of leadership? And the starting definition was creating outcomes that matter most. So how do you step into your life and create what matters most? That's a pretty good definition of self-mastery or self-leadership. What we saw yesterday took that to a whole new level, right? Like, how do you surrender yourself into what wants to have its way with your life and give your life over, come what may? That's another level of leadership, one that like Bill said, what do we know about leadership? So I walked away from yesterday humbled and challenged, provoked and disturbed. Okay, Where's the edge for me to step up more and more into what wants to have its way with my life? And so when we talk about conscious leadership or integral leadership, I think that's what we're really talking about. How do we move from being self-authored to being authored?
Next level out of that is what it means to actually take that same creating outcomes that matter most and bringing that into the collective and really capacity and capability of the organization that we work in, to the communities that we're part of, to the planet that we all have responsibility for and gratitude to. And this whole notion of increasing capacity and capability and collective leadership is where the scaling conversation started for us about 7 or 8 years ago. And that scaling conversation in and of itself, and how it is that we capture that collective, that in many cases less than tapped resource to make a difference, is what's going to make the difference. Because if we can't do it collectively, it's going to be very difficult for it to happen individually. It's not enough. It's important, but not sufficient. And yesterday, as Bob said, that came through loud and clear to us with what has happened post-1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated. What's happened since Jimmy Carter and Rosalynn dedicated their lives post when he was present here in the U.S. And we heard yesterday that from 3 million cases of guinea worm across the world, they're down to 9 after the years of taking that on, and that's one example. That's one example, and it didn't take just one leader or two. It took scaling that capacity and capability across many, many leaders.
And so this notion of scale, it's like, how do you scale into this world? We don't have to talk about VUCA, right? You would know about VUCA. And so the leading responses from what we can see in our work around the world have to do with how do we create a whole new kind of organization? How do we redesign organizations so they're more agile, more innovative, more adaptive, more creative, more engaged? All this language you put around that. And our take is that stuff won't boot up unless we're leading it consciously. It literally won't boot up on reactive leadership. I had the opportunity this year to speak at the first Conscious Capitalism conference in Europe. And if you're familiar with conscious capitalism, John Mackey and Ross Sisota wrote this book, Conscious Capitalism. And I read the book in preparation for the conference. It felt like coming home. I strongly recommend it. It's very aligned with all that we're doing. How do you create a conscious business, meaning one that's focused on higher purpose? And in service of that, you create conscious culture, and you integrate and optimize. This is big systems thinking, right? You integrate and optimize the welfare of all stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, owners, including the communities in which we live and including the environment. So the environment, the ecology of the world, is a stakeholder. And of course, none of that happens without conscious leadership. None of it. It won't boot up. And so that's what we're here to kind of talk about today.
We play this out, and most of you, if not everyone's familiar with the way we describe the development gap and what's required from the world that we live in of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and how that's increasing, and the real contrast with the stability, certainty, and that simplicity, clarity that sometimes for me only comes in moments now. It's fascinating that I don't believe I ever thought life was simple. I'm not sure that's how I'm wired. But what I do know is that it's more complex for me and for us in the world that we're living in today than I ever remember previously. That doesn't mean that I have to over-complexify it. It doesn't mean there's not simplicity within it. It doesn't mean that I can't stand on values that are home for me, home base, or for us, of what's really, really important. And what does it mean to actually navigate through that world and embrace the fact that developmentally, we've got work to do there.
We were just with Bob and Lisa a couple of weeks ago. Very interesting day-long conversation, but here's their take. When we experience the world as too complex, we're not just experiencing the complexity of the world, we're experiencing the mismatch between the world's complexity and our own at the moment. This is brilliant. So when we talk about a development gap, we're not talking about a hole in you, some missing element in you as a leader. We're talking about the relationship between your level of development and the complexity of the context that you're asked to lead in. And you cannot not be in over your head. And so there's two ways to mend this mismatch. Reduce the world's complexity. I think we're actually in a time where we're trying to do that. And it's not going to work. Or increase your own, right? And so that's the notion here. How do we face and lean into our development gaps? We all have them. I mean, when we look at what's happening in our business, we're so far over our head every day.
Oh, come on. I mean, seriously. I mean, that doesn't even get close to describing it right now. Like, okay, you wake up in the morning and that first email's like, never dealt with this before. Fascinating. And I don't know them. But I should. And it's a good experience for us because we're in a position where we're literally at the moment on a stage. And I would suggest for both Bob and I, that's somewhat reluctantly. It doesn't mean that we haven't stepped ourselves into and haven't stepped in. It means that it requires learning out loud in a way that I didn't know was going to actually hit me personally.
We never envisioned this.
I mean, seriously.
Not this.
Bob and I sat like two old grumpy men about 8 years ago in a cabin in the mountains. And we got up one morning to have this conversation about how we're going to fully embrace this. And I'll never forget the scene. I mean, it was like two old dudes in bathrobes with their, slippers on. And I'm thinking, yeah, this is going to be big.
Let's start a business.
Yeah, let's go into business together. And
how about a new startup?
Oh, wait a minute. We have been for 4 years. And the conversation went like this. We've been working for 30 years. How much of this are we actually going to give away? Wait a minute, we're actually creating our own competitors. We're actually going to scale into our own competitors. Now, that doesn't make any sense coming from my, reactive mind. That makes absolutely no sense. Are you kidding me? I've been competing against that my entire life. And it's hard to compete against. More resources, better, smarter, all those things that run in that voice in my head. We said, no, that's what we're going to do. And we turn around now and we go, wow, this is way beyond what we envisioned. And it keeps expanding. And this development gap is part of that. I love this notion. When I first started 30 years ago using the word transformation, people in the organizations I walk into would go, shh, say that quietly. Transformation, that's kind of radical. Seriously, that won't go well here. That's not how we talk in corporate. I know you're from the West, but that's not how we talk in corporate. Now, when I talk about the development gap, here's the frame that comes back. Gap's kind of negative. Is it? Are you kidding me? Seriously, we were born into this world to grow. How many of you have taken the time with a toddler to convince them they shouldn't learn how to walk and fully embrace it? Oh, don't stumble. Seriously, wait till you're ready for that. Cindy and I've got 9 grandkids. That's not the way it works. They fully embrace life. And then somewhere along the path we go, wait a minute, don't talk about the development gap because we're adults. We don't have that. Come on, people. Embrace it fully because it's growth, it's learning, it's opportunity. It's what actually feeds us as human beings. And to be fully able to embrace this and understand that it challenges us and produces life's blood is where we want to take it.
You cannot not. There's no shame in it. This is the beautiful thing about it. How do we hold it with compassion? Because you cannot not be in over your head. So come on, it's welcome to the human race. Let's get on with it. It's a great frame. It's a great frame. Okay, so conscious business. The organization is not going to perform at a higher level of performance than the conscious of leadership. This is one of our foundational principles. And to get there is a hero's journey, and it's not for the faint of heart. You ignore it at your peril. The foundation for a conscious business is conscious leadership. Nothing happens without it, really. And so that's really what we're focused on. When you talk about leadership or mastering anything, whether it's sports or music or anything, it's a well-honed outer game. You have to get good at it. There's constant practice and refining and learning. Well-honed outer game arising on a highly mature inner game. And when you get those two together, something extraordinary happens. And so you're running two games all the time, the outer game and the inner game. You got the outer game of your knowledge, your skills, your experience, your learning, all of that, technical expertise. And then you're running an inner game. The inner game runs the outer game. So in any moment, leadership is the deployment of self into circumstances. You are your primary asset. In any situation, what you bring to that moment is your leverage, is your influence. And so clearly you're working your outer game, but at the same moment, how are you deploying yourself into that moment? Which self is showing up? Which mental models are running you? Which meaning-making system is happening? How are you interpreting reality and then processing it, making decisions on it? What level of self-awareness do you bring to that moment? Level of emotional intelligence? What beliefs and assumptions that govern your identity, that shape who you think you have to be in that moment? All of that's happening in every moment. And so this notion of development actually deeply involves the inner game, as we all know, and this is the notion of consciousness. So the inner game runs the outer game. And it evolves through stages. I think of it as an operating system. It's much more beautiful than that, actually. There's so much innate beauty in each of us. But kind of as a metaphor, it is a structure, and structure determines performance. And the design, you've been designing your inner game your whole life. The design of it is actually deploying you all the time. And it evolves through stages, and many of you are familiar with this. We spent the day with Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy, foremost researchers on adult development in the world. When I read Bob's book, In Over Our Heads, in the 90s, it rocked my world. It completely reframed how I thought about leadership. It's the biggest frame I've come across. Adults can evolve like children. If they evolve through very measurable stages of development. And each one is, each progressive stage is more adapted for the kind of complexities that we're in. And so we have, and thanks to Steve, we've been working with this notion of this splitting apart a bit. You'll see a little different frame in our new book where we're saying there's a stages of leadership that are underpinned by stages of consciousness, right? And so it isn't this neat, but basically the notion here is that when we're running reactive, we tend to be more in a socialized mind, and then so on and so on. And so we want to unpack this notion for just a minute.
Before you go there, Bob, as we play this out, the stages of leadership, it's starting to show up in the language now around leadership. And it's starting to come back at us in a way that has been, again, somewhat surprising, that we have reactive leadership, we have creative leadership, and what does it actually mean to move in an integral? And why is it important, and how important is it for what's being required? And so when you think about stages of consciousness and stages of leadership, reactive leadership, creative leadership, what does it mean to move into integral? How is that starting to navigate itself in the universe? And what's happening now, both across our clients and within our clients, the customers that are choosing to use this, is that it's actually given us a point on that path of development. So that whole notion, when I was early on, 25 years ago, and this became part of our languages, leadership's the most studied and least understood thing there is. That's just not true anymore. We understand what makes leadership work, what makes it effective, how it can be more effective, what makes it less effective, how you can cancel it out, how you can amplify it. That's there for us, and it works through stages. I can find out where I am at any given time. As we play this thing out, Bob and I were in this conversation 2 weeks ago with Amy and Jim Anderson, and we were with an executive team, and they've declared for a conscious business that is based on the principle of love. They've declared multi-billion-dollar company for a conscious business that's based on the principle of love. And their belief is the world doesn't want that, then it'll put them out of business. But they're not going to not take a stand for it. And then they're up against their own pathway of development. They said, we want to have a conversation about integral. And we looked at their profiles and said, that's not exactly where we're going to start. So maybe you'll love this. Everyone in the room gets this. We got to change the slide. The proposal said integral, deep dive to integral. We're actually going to go on a conscious path of development.
We changed it to deep dive into creative.
Starting with the reactive.
Starting with the reactive. No shame in that.
No shame in it.
Welcome to the club, right? Let's get on with it. And so a lot happens with these shifts, and we're just going to just brief here. But time frames change. We were looking yesterday, we were seeing time frames of centuries, impact over centuries. And of course, most of what we're seeing is months and quarters, right? Quarterly, crisis, problem, fix, so on. So as consciousness expands, its time horizons of influence expand. And with that, we move from shifting from problems seeking solutions. Really interesting to hear the principles of nonviolence yesterday. You don't focus on the symptom or even the problem. The solution statement is, the issue statement embeds the systemic solution in it. Brilliant, long term, but not problem fix. And then, of course, that moves on as leadership evolves into vision, but as it matures and matures, it's self-authored vision, deeply purposeful, higher purpose, informing vision, and then strategy to create it. And of course, at an integral level, you're taking responsibility for the welfare of the whole system, if not the world. So what I learned yesterday was that I wasn't being called to take responsibility for an issue in the world, or this organization in the world. I was being called to take responsibility for the welfare of the planet.
Well, and as Dr. King, again, way impacted in unexpected way yesterday. He would talk about local action with national implication. How is it that we take action locally and it applies nationally and then globally? So lift where you stand from a leadership perspective and know that it crosses all of that. You play yourself out here in a very frame, just such an important frame that we all get the financial. We got locked into forever. Quarterly results, months. It's a reactive mindset. Now, I want to get clear about this. That doesn't mean that quarterly financial results are not important. You don't get it if you don't have them. We don't get to play. So taking any one of these frames, reactive, creative to integral, and thinking that we can put a, wrong, right kind of frame on it, that's not true. They build upon one another. And then they include what was right behind it. Quarterly results are still important. Monthly action is still important. But within the larger frame of decades, it changes the game. Within the larger frame of years, it changes the game.
Each of those is underpinned by an inner game. And so Keegan talks about being socialized. Larry Wilson talks about play not to lose. And so we're actually being authored in the our earlier lives by all the expectations of the surround, what we've been told we have to be, how we have to be in order to be okay, what makes me good, worthwhile, valuable, has all been given to me. You define me. You make me up. And so I'm actually in a play not to lose game. I'm trying to forward my objectives, but not disappoint. And that has inherent limitations. It takes us so far. And as you know from our work, there's lots of variations on this. High control, play not to lose by taking control. Play not to lose by playing small. Doesn't matter the form, it's the same structure. As that evolves, it moves into being authored by self. How do I listen within? There's a lot of emphasis yesterday in the inner voice, both from Carter and from Martin Luther King. A deep listening to what my own life wants to come through, and then authoring that, and then playing on purpose. Very different operating system, and it's and this is a huge shift. This is a huge shift, and I think even we now, especially with the written comment analysis in this new book, are realizing how big that shift is. And this shift is equally big. To move into, to start to see that this well-honed, authentic, high-integrity self that I've created, creating an organization I believe in around me, is only half the picture. I thought it was the whole picture. Then I see that I'm both dark and light. Some of us come from very troubled parts of the world, deeply embedded conflict. When you really get this, you're both sides of that conflict. So the Israeli meets the inner Palestinian. And I don't say that humorously. I say that knowing how embittered that conflict is. I have all that in me. There is no enemy. Yesterday we heard King say, how can I violate another when they are me? And so when we start to see ourselves as broken and whole, then we meet the broken and wholeness in the world with compassion. It's like, okay, let's talk. And so you got Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin actually being held in a container of compassion and support from Jimmy Carter, by Jimmy Carter. And peace can break out. And this is the power of the self-transforming leader.
And when you play this out across reactive, creative, integral, and we'll show in a moment, here's the difference between, you all know this, right? The difference between high reactive leader and a high creative is night and day. When you look at, experience, and are part of high reactivity and high creativity, both with results, they're night and day difference. They're not the same leadership. We believe that integral is that significant plus. So as we're stepping into understanding what's this next stage of leadership called integral, given 80% that we measure as it plays itself out up here, comes out on the reactive in the way we play, 70, 80%, and all of a sudden we're talking about what's required for the world, we know the difference between creative and integral is as significant plus the difference between that exists on reactive and creative.
So to create the kind of agile, innovative, adaptive, conscious businesses that we've been articulating for years requires creative minimum, and 80% of us. This is the gap. We're all in it.
Yesterday, we had a gentleman speak to us for 20 minutes or so at the MLK Center, and he's been training nonviolence and the King philosophy for a long time now. Very impressive. And he talked about the world has 10% of it that creates violence. It gets all the focus. There's 90% of the globe that wants nonviolence. What does it require of us to make that shift? To focus on and pay attention to and eliminate what doesn't work for what works. And then he said, and I had to do that in myself. I was a cop I grew up in St. Louis, cop there for a number of years, police officer, captain for 10, and I was raised in violence. I fully embraced violence. When I was 9 years old, I got beat by a stick because I wanted to be. Beat by sticks when I wanted to be in a public pool, and then they tried to hang me. And at 9, I'm saying, why do they hate me? They don't know me. I was raised in violence, and I acted out in violence, and I had to shift that myself because I want to be that 90% that doesn't embrace violence.
So how do we do it? How do we scale it? I'm going to cut through a bunch here just really quick, but this is what the Leadership Circle was designed for. It's a developmental can opener. It's what it really was about, right? How do we work the outer game and the inner game simultaneously in a developmental framework? And that's really what it was about. And of course, it looks like this. Now, for those of you who don't know the Leadership Circle, it looks like a radar screen. It's a little overly complex at first, but so let me just orient you to it. Real simple. It looks like this, right? So the top half are creative competencies. These are the kinds of competencies that have been well researched in the field to correlate well to leadership, effectiveness, and business performance. I didn't make this up. The field has done a ton of research here. And if you look at it, it hones down to a list of very key things. And it's not a 65 list, it's more like 18, 20 kind of number. And so we have 18 key competencies in the top half of the profile, and here's our data. So here we got a measure of leadership effectiveness on the bottom, or across the, and the average key creative competence scores on the bottom, right? Follow that? High or low correlation? Pretty high. The 90.93, you don't get any higher than that. What's perfect? 1. Positive correlation means that as your creative competencies increase, what's going to happen to your effectiveness? It's going up and highly likely. So that's the data on that. You want to see strong scores in the top half of the circle. And then, of course, the bottom half of the circle is reactive tendencies or reactive styles. Hear this. These are not weaknesses. They are strengths being run through a reactive, play not to lose structure, where I'm identified with the strength. So we talked last year about when I got clear with Bill and a conflict we were in, that the reason I was showing up so arrogantly in the conflict was because I was identified with these ideas. These ideas are mine. These ideas are me. This book I wrote is me. Not true. None of it's true. But when I'm identified, I'm taking a strength I have around ideas, and I'm creating a liability with it, canceling it out, especially as it relates to collaboration and generation of new ideas. And so these are strengths run reactive, and when we do that, they're actually inversely correlated to effectiveness, and pretty strongly so. We interrupt, we cancel out our own strength. And of course, the top half and the bottom half, therefore, are correlated. So here's the average score in the bottom half, reactive, correlated against the average score in the top half, creative. And you got an inverse correlation of 0.76, highly negative correlation, which means as your reactive scores go up, what's happening to your creative scores? They're coming down, and this is what makes it a dynamic model for development. I can see the interrelationship between any dimension in the profile and how one affects the other. And then, of course, underneath that is a map of consciousness. What self am I deploying? What inner game assumptions am I running that actually create those dynamic interactions and patterns in my data? And so it creates breakthroughs really quickly. And that's the profile. This would be a perfect one. This is the profile both Bill and I wish we had.
Aspiration is still alive and well.
Actually, this comes from our culture survey overlaid on this framework. But our culture survey, we asked the question, what's the kind of leadership, this relates to the VUCA environment, what's the kind of leadership that if it existed in the organization would allow it to thrive in its current marketplace and into the future? And this is the picture we get. All over the world, some variation in the bottom half, which we talked about in Mastering Leadership and we could talk about, but basically it's the same picture. So when Bill said we know what it is, we know what it is. So get this, we ask a lot, how many would say leadership matters, you know? Like to the performance of the organization, the effectiveness, individual and collective, right? Everybody agrees with that. Never get pushback to that. And we know what it is. We're taking a really strong stand for that in this book. Let's get real here. We know, leaders know what great leadership looks like. They can describe it with precision. It looks like this. And in this system, scores radiate from center. So the further out, the stronger your scores. So you got real high scores in the top half, low scores in the bottom half. This would be an optimal profile. When I prepared for Conscious Capitalism, there's some research in the back of the book that was updated. Raj wrote a book called Firms of Endearment. Love that title, Firms of Endearment, where he studied the performance of organizations that were rated like Best Place to Work or Conscious Business and so on, and he found a really strong performance. He updated that for this book, and they found that over a 15-year period, those companies that were rated as high on conscious leadership measures and also high on great places to work measures, 2.5 to 3 times outperformed the marketplace over a 15-year period, and two times or 3 times, I can't remember exactly, outperformed the good to great companies that were written up in Collins's book. So consciousness matters. And of course, our data on this is pretty straightforward. You've seen this graphic, most of you. But we're framing it a little different right now. We ask, actually we have asked 2,000 leaders to evaluate both the effectiveness of the leader they're rating and the performance of that business against certain metrics like market share, sales, revenue, quality of products and services, and so on. And we find this correlation between a perceptive measure, get this, perceptive measure of how the business is performing and a perceptive measure of how you're showing up as a leader. So what is this? This is the view around the world. There's 250,000 surveys in this picture of how do leaders see the relationship between effectiveness in leadership and how the business performs. And it's a very solid, positive correlation. Well, we got curious about this, as you know. Couldn't resist this. Wonder what the aggregate leadership profile looks like of this group of leaders, the leaders who are leading or seen as leading high-performing businesses. And this one was, couldn't resist this, right? And here's what we found. Here's the aggregate leadership profile of the leaders in the businesses that were evaluated as highest performing, top 10%. And here's the aggregate leadership profile of those leaders in underperforming businesses, bottom 10%. Now, if you go back and forth, you get the picture. These are very, very different. And they have very different levels of performance related with it. So that's the notion. Now, how do you scale that? How do you scale that transition?
So you play this out, and we're going to take about 5 or 6 more minutes here, and then we're going to take a break in the middle and come back. So when we talk about scaling leadership, and we'll unpack this a little bit more after the break, we know, and we want you to just take in for a minute the simplicity here, and don't get deceived. Easily said, hard to do. Start with self. You are your project. Easy to say, hard to do. I'm not even sure it's easy to say. How is it we're going to develop teams? How are we going to develop leadership teams? Scale to those teams. And then how are we going to build that system? And what does that mean? What does that look like? Because if we don't start with self, then nothing changes.
All things change when we do. Love this poem by Zen master. He says, "The hand moves. The hand moves, and the fire's whirling takes different shapes. The hand moves, and the fire's whirling takes different shapes. All things change when we do. The first word, blossoms into all others. Each of them is true. The hand moves, and the fire's whirling takes different shapes. All things change when we do." And that's a journey. There's no way around it. It's a hero or heroine's journey. The person that you are when you start the journey is not the one that finishes it.
We're going to share 3 leaders today in the second half of this that are on that journey, and in it one which happens to be here with us, and we'll play that out. Full spectrum leadership. 28% high reactive, low creative, 22 mid-reactive, 22 mid-creative, and 28 high creative. This is across the norm base. Now, this is really key in the last 3 minutes or 4 minutes here. We worked, I entered into this field 1984 officially, as an independent in 1979 or so inside corporate. We were constantly fighting for credibility. We were constantly fighting to be able to actually get jurisdiction to do the work. And we, Bob and I, from 2 different angles, very much came together 10, 12 years ago and just shared with you the results of a significant portion of that, which is, hey, leadership effectiveness is quantitative. You can measure it. It makes a difference in business results. That was all out of bringing that credibility to it, and we walk in and we say, yeah, we understand what a high creative leader's profile works, but look what's on the top of that. Look what's on the top of those 18 competencies. And then we dive in and say, we know what that mid-creative profile looks like. There's actually a development path in here, difference between high creative, mid-creative, mid-reactive. Wow, check that out. Remember we talked a few moments ago? Difference between high reactive and high creative is a night and day difference. You can see it all the way along. It's distinct. Mid-reactive leader's profile, high reactive leader's profile, and then what shows up.
Let me just weigh in here just a minute, because here's a few thoughts on this. The difference between this profile and this profile, from a statistical standpoint, just from high reactive to mid-reactive, blew our statisticians away. When they look at things like effect size, which is, would this leader show up as effectively different? If you get to 0.3, you're like, the answer is yes. These leaders would show up differently. The effect size difference here was somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2. Like huge. And the same was true for this one. So this one, to this one, to this one, to this one. You get very measurable, very distinctly different leaders likely to show up in each of these categories. And this was a sampling we did for the book that built the comment study. And so then you look at all that, how different those are, and then it shows up in the comments, like big time. They couldn't have been more different.
When you take these comments, and this is the, oh, wait a minute, maybe we ought to do a little bit from the quantitative to the qualitative, and we've got thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of open-ended comments with leaders looking at other leaders, or their direct reports are looking at them and telling us what makes effective. Then what shows up on the high creative, all the blue, is something that looks like that.
The blues are strengths. These are bubble charts.
You saw this last year.
Right?
I mean, you know, you're looking again. We're not gonna spend a long time on this, but wait a minute, showstopper. How many didn't know strong people skills was important for effective leadership? Right? And how far away did we get from that? So the quantitative and the qualitative is incredibly important, and play it out from high creative to high reactive and the difference between the two. High creative and high reactive. Those are qualitatively different leaders, qualitatively different experience. I aspire to be in this organization, thank you very much. In fact, I'm looking for someone that has a really ineffective interaction style. Please join me, because I'd love to work for you, and maybe we could just add a little bit of over-demanding. So you're going to be ineffective in the way you interact with me, and then you're going to demand more. I'll sign up for that all day long. Seriously, we knew this. We understood this. Now we've got quantitative. I mean, think about that. 0.93, negative 0.76. And this is what it looks like when it shows up high reactive, high creative, and this is what happens.
And this isn't us saying this. This is just us counting scores on comments that leaders, this is leaders talking to leaders, right? So we see it. And part of what's landed for us was we don't have to create a feedback-rich environment. You're in one.
Yeah, you need to harvest it.
It's all around you. How do you harvest it? Do you use it? Because people see you in action, and the quantitative and the qualitative parallel each other almost exactly. So leaders see other leaders with great precision.
Oh yeah, they lay it out really clear. This is real effective. This is not. This is real effective. This is not. This is real effective. This is not. Right? And we knew this. And we spent a long time discounting it. And now it's time to get back to it for all of us. And here's what plays itself out as the last thing before we go on break. We call this the canceling and the amplifying effect. The amplification takes place on both. It sounds something like this: mid-creative and above. Wow. You know, we got to really talk about Sue. She's just not the best listener. She's just not the best listener. But you know what? It doesn't matter, because she's the best leader I've ever worked for. I've never had a leader like Sue. Yeah, she could listen a little bit better, but who cares? Are you kidding me? Best leadership experience I've had. That's amplification on mid to high creative. The opposite side is, oh, you know, Bill doesn't listen very well, but man, that's just the start of his list. It amplifies the opposite way. It's a canceling effect. So you take all of those incredible pieces of effectiveness from a leadership perspective, again, high creative, low creative on the blue and the red, and you add that and you cancel it out and you amplify the opposite. And you've all either done it yourselves, most of us, or experienced it with others. And so the grace that exists in the system for high creative is less existent in high reactive.
We work with
absolutely key.
We work with a number of frameworks and build them throughout the book. One is differentiating strengths. What are the key strengths when you look at the differences between high reactive that really differentiate leadership? And when you look at reactive strengths, those differentiating strengths are not there. There are strengths identified, but they're more technical and intellectual and brilliant and so on. You're trying to run your leadership through your own creative brilliance. It has limits to scale. So if you take differentiating strength as a number, some quantitative number, times your leadership ratio, which is strengths to liabilities, times your task relationship balance, you get an amplification effect, a multiplication effect. And it works both ways. Any one of those numbers starts to decline, it multiplies itself.
Can't help ourselves, can we, on that quantitative?
No, got to go there.
Effective leaders make a qualitative difference in the lives of those that work with them, that are part of what they do. A qualitative difference in the quality of their lives, and a quantitative difference in the results achieved. Hear that. Qualitative difference in the lives of those we lead, and a quantitative difference in the results we achieve. Less effective, more effective. It doesn't mean right or wrong, good or bad. It's part of the development pathway that is a gap we should all embrace.